Welcome to Zoom In, Zoom Out, your in-depth look at news from around the world. I'm Sally Jensen. China's suppression of religious freedoms is well documented, and around the world, the ruling Communist Party's systemic erasure of Islam in the Xinjiang region is common knowledge. But new findings show that these oppressions are also happening elsewhere in the country under official CCP policy of Sinicization, Beijing's process of cultural assimilation. Observing from the outside, what could governments and societies be doing to bring an end to what many have called a cultural genocide? Working to document these human rights violations is no simple task. We caught up with Elaine Pearson, the Asia Director of Human Rights Watch, to find out more. She started by zooming in on a new report about mosque consolidation in China.
Well, I know mosque consolidation might sound like an innocuous term, but what this is about the systematic demolition, destruction, and alteration of mosques in order to give them Chinese characteristics. Now, this is happening under Xi Jinping's policy from April 2018, which was about the Sinification of religion. And what we've seen in Gansu and in Ningxia provinces is that a significant number of mosques have had their minarets removed, had their domes removed, have been made to resemble more traditional Chinese buildings. And all of this is really in an effort to try and deter people from praying and to deter Muslims from pursuing their faith. So this is a systematic violation of religious freedom that is happening in China today. And Xinjiang is well known as ground zero for religious repression, but I think it is really alarming to see that these practices are also happening in other provinces in China.
And can you tell us a little bit about the methodology that went into this report? What was the evidence that you found, and how do you know for certain that this mosque consolidation is happening?
Well, sadly, Human Rights Watch doesn't have access to China, alongside a lot of journalists and human rights organizations that cannot go to document these issues. So what we did was we used satellite imagery and we looked at mosques in the two provinces over a period of time. And what we found was that since 2018, since this policy, in one area, 7 mosques had had their minarets and domes removed. In other cases, some of the ablution halls were removed or repurposed. We also spoke to individuals who had been to some of these mosques and were able to confirm that this had occurred. But it is very difficult to do this kind of research. We also used open source means to really look at what local Communist Party officials have said in Ningxia and Gansu. And some of them have been quite open, actually, about the number of mosques that have been merged or consolidated because they're trying to show the central government that they're applying this policy. So we're also going off official party documents where they say that they have reduced the number of mosques in these two provinces.
And what does this look like specifically for the people who want to go to worship at these mosques? What is happening across China for their freedom to be able to worship?
Well, these are Hui Muslims, and they're very fearful now because, the mosques that are remaining are under heavy surveillance. Sometimes they have cameras installed outside. They feel that, their religion is something that is now perceived as a threat. And so they're very confused and they're worried about the future and what that will mean.
And as we have just said, many people are aware of the oppression of religion in China's Xinjiang region. But how long has this been happening for example, in Ningxia and Gansu?
So Xi Jinping made a speech in April of 2016, which was the first time that he called for the Sinification of religion, which is basically turning religion into something with Chinese characteristics. Since then, in April 2018, we had a written policy document which talked about the obligation of religions and houses of worship to promote Communist Party ideology. And so in that time, since 2018, we have seen a number of mosques either demolished, destroyed, or altered in different ways. So this is a very recent phenomenon. Some of the satellite imagery is dating from 2020.
And why is the Chinese Communist Party so afraid of Islam? And is it the case with other religions in China?
Well, that's a good question. So, I think all religion is viewed as a threat to the Communist Party because it somehow is seen as something that, challenges the power of the state. So certainly we have also seen, we've documented similar patterns with Christianity. So we have seen the removal of crosses from churches in some places in China. Obviously in Tibet, there has been a long-term religious repression. We've seen monks self-immolate in protest in Tibet. But I think what is happening to Islam is really linked to the way in which the Chinese government perceives Islam as a threat, and it is really linked to an effort to try and de-radicalize anyone who is Muslim. We've seen that play out, in really terrible ways in Xinjiang, where crimes against humanity are being committed against Uyghurs and other Turkic Muslims. Now, what is happening in Ningxia and Gansu, it's not the same, but I think this type of attack and destruction of houses of worship, it really is trying to erase elements of Islamic identity. And so it really seeps into this idea that somehow Islam is something foreign, that it's not Chinese. And this really goes against the fact that, there's a long history of Islam in China, dating back 1,500 years.
And China often makes a big thing about its, it has over 50 ethnic minorities. And you see it, around the country in tourist areas. There are people dressing up in various costumes. Does this bear any relation to that? Because it seems like China is almost proud of having this diversity, but at the same time is acting in kind of oppressing people's religious freedoms.
I think the approach of the Communist Party is that, yes, they want ethnic people to dress up in costumes, to perform, to sing and dance. And certainly we've seen that in Xinjiang. And I think it's important to see that some mosques in some places have been untouched because those are tourist areas. And so, in that sense, it's really treating religion and also ethnic identity something that is tokenistic. In reality, it's not the way in which the Chinese government is portraying it. In reality, what is happening is that this is a gradual, systematic erasure of people's cultural and religious identity. And I think that's something that is really chilling to see that happening in China today.
Let's take a kind of a zoom out look at what sinicization is. And so, like you said, it's something that the Communist Party recently kind of implemented. Is it just happening to religions in China, or is it also happening in other areas of life, for example, in ethnic and cultural spheres?
Well, I think it's been particularly targeting religion, but we've also seen, certain sites of important historical significance to Uyghurs or to other groups, in some cases, demolished or eradicated. And so I think it is about this sort of gradual desire to create one Chinese identity. And that means a Chinese identity that is very loyal to the party state. And so it is all about ensuring that ideology is a big part of that. And so there's no room for any dissent. Even when people have wanted to, for instance, speak their own language, then there's been a lot of linguistic repression in places like Tibet, in Xinjiang, we also know in southern Mongolia. So this repression is resulting in people sort of losing a lot of touch with their origins.
Can you tell us, is this all at odds with international human rights conventions, and how so?
So this is a violation of religious freedom, and this is something that is guaranteed under international law. It's also something that's guaranteed under the Chinese Constitution. So, under international law, people should have the right to pray, to freely express their religion. And so I think the ways in which the Chinese Communist Party is really trying to sort of scrape or eradicate, the so-called Arab elements of the religion by removing the domes, removing the minarets, removing any sort of Arab calligraphy outside the mosques. This is an interference in religious freedom.
And speaking of threats to state power, we're also, this is now the 1-year anniversary of China's A4 revolution, where hundreds or thousands of people took to the streets in kind of protest at the government, ostensibly for its COVID-19 policies. And obviously, this is a huge moment in a country that's usually suppressed disruptive action or public movements. Has Human Rights Watch's work in China changed since then? Have you seen any major changes in the last few decades, or was that a changing point for your work there?
The white paper protests 1 year ago, it was amazing actually to see the courage of young people coming out, thousands of young people in different cities across China. And the fact that they held up blank pieces of paper just shows all that cannot be said in China today. And what we know happened as a result is that people were systematically arrested, rounded up, detained, in some cases charged. And we don't know exactly what's happened to a lot of those people. We don't know what's happened to Peng Lifa, the person who actually put a banner up over the bridge in Beijing, which was one of the initial elements that sort of gave people the courage to participate in the white paper protests. So what we've seen, over the past decade or so is really a very steady deterioration in human rights. We've seen a greater crackdown. Obviously, it's been worse in places like Xinjiang, where the Chinese government is committing crimes against humanity by arbitrarily detaining huge numbers of the population. But we've also seen religious repression in Tibet. We've seen the dismantling of democracy in Hong Kong. And we've seen, human rights lawyers, government critics, citizen journalists, bloggers, anyone who speaks up and challenges the Chinese government or criticizes them in any way is vulnerable to arrest and detention. And that even goes for foreign journalists in China. I mean, we've seen Cheng Lei, the Australian journalist who was only recently released, but many of these people arrested and detained on spurious national security charges.
And so with all of this kind of seemingly going on and getting worse even, what future do you see for China's human rights?
Well, I think foreign governments really need to stand up to the Chinese government and hold the Chinese government accountable for these abuses. And I think for a long time, there's been a reluctance to do that because China is an important trading partner, often the number one trading partner for a lot of countries. But I think what's happened in recent years has been a real wake-up call, particularly for Western governments. And we're now seeing the way in which they're trying to diversify their trade interests to other countries. But I also think that countries really need to work together and make it very clear to the Chinese government that we see these abuses that are taking place. And, we want to ask questions about them and we want you to address these concerns because it's not okay to systematically repress the rights of Muslims, of Christians, of other minorities in China today. And it's certainly not okay to completely repress the rights of your citizens and give them no opportunity to freely express themselves.
Is China almost exporting these human rights violations abroad? Have you seen this in the Asia region at all, that similar kinds of oppressions are happening elsewhere?
Yeah, I think the international community should be concerned because these abuses are not just taking place inside China today. They're also taking place outside. And so in Asia, we've seen the Chinese government putting pressure on governments like Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, Laos to return anyone who is a government critic. We've also seen abusive Belt and Road projects in places like Cambodia, where villagers have been removed from their land and haven't been adequately compensated in order to make way for a dam. So I think it's actually really important to continue to document these cases of transnational repression, intimidation, harassment, surveillance, and activities that are now taking place outside China as well as it exports its model of repression to other countries.
Thanks so much for coming on the show, Elaine.
Thanks for having me.
This has been Zoom In, Zoom Out. You can find more stories from TaiwanPlus by following us on social media. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.